What should you keep in mind when you want to buy a duplex or triplex and use it as both primary residence and an investment property? You may know that when you live in the property and rent out the rest, it's a great way to get your foot in the door into real estate investing. However, you may not have the right realtor or mortgage lender to give you advice along the way. After all, once you buy a duplex, you are now becoming a landlord. Even if you only have one tenant to worry about, you are a landlord. And when you buy a multifamily, typically it requires more capital than if you were to buy a single family property, and you may worry, am I taking on too much risk? So in today's video, I'm going to go over 5 questions you should ask as you're evaluating a potential duplex where you can live in it and rent out the rest, and allow you to put the least amount down as well as get the lowest mortgage rates possible given today's interest rate environment. So let's get started. I'm Veronica Woods, and welcome back or to the Real Estate Wisdom channel, where we provide market updates about real estate in the Philadelphia and suburban Delaware County areas, as well as we give out tips about how to manage and keep and grow a profitable rental property portfolio. If you want to reach out to me and talk one-on-one about a real estate dilemma on your plate, you can contact me at any of the contact information that's directly below this video in the description area. I also have a few great downloads that answer some questions, whether you inherited a property or you're selling a property or want to learn more about stats about multifamilies. Go ahead and click and download one of those guides. So with that, let's get into the 5 questions that you should ask as you're evaluating potential deals where you're thinking seriously about living in the property that's also an investment. And if you want to know another name for this that may be around online, people use the term house hacking in those internet streets, as I call them. So we're talking about the same thing, where it's either a duplex or actually even up to a 4-unit property. But we're going to go into the 5 questions that would apply nonetheless. The first question you have to ask yourself is, do you want to live there? Like, why waste your time looking at properties that you just never want to live in, even for the short period of time that's going to be required for you to get that owner-occupied financing? So first, you want to kind of have a neighborhood to budget match, similar to any sort of investment property or a house that you use for your primary residence. You kind of have to figure out, all right, based on what my budget is, do I want to live in this neighborhood? That's kind of like on the high end. And then on the lower end of the budget, just eliminate the neighborhoods that you just don't want to live in, even for a short period of time. Once you kind of gravitated to a specific neighborhood, then you kind of have to evaluate the property types in terms of, you know, if it's let's take the example of a duplex. You know, would you mind living in a 1-bedroom? So if you know that you can't tolerate living in a 1-bedroom even for a year, then don't look for a property that doesn't have at least 1 2-bedroom unit. So you'll see a lot of, you know, the smaller duplexes maybe just have 2 1-bedroom units. And again, if you need to live in at least a 2-bedroom to feel comfortable even for a year, just eliminate those from your criteria. Now, generally, the duplexes, this is a generality, generally the duplexes probably more likely have a 2 or maybe even a 3-bedroom unit within the building. Once you get to 4 bedrooms, usually they have smaller units inside. And that's just a generality. But again, you have to be comfortable with the property has to have a size of unit that you would be comfortable living in. And then another dynamic of the building type would be, you know, are you comfortable living in a row home? If you take the Philadelphia area, we have a lot of properties that are where you have neighbors on both sides. Is that something that you would consider living in for a short period of time? Or do you want to only look at properties that are either fully detached with no neighbors, or attached close on one side of the building, or semi-detached? Again, you'll have to kind of constrain your search parameters to the type of buildings in the neighborhood and the style of structure that you would be comfortable living in, if only for 1 year. The second question you should ask yourself, and some may argue this is one of the most critical questions, is what is your potential cash flow? Now, from a house hacking perspective, when you're living in a property, there's two ways that you need to evaluate cash flow. The first is when you're living in a property, what's the cash flow? And by cash flow, throughout the definition real quick, is taking the gross rent minus the operating expenses minus the mortgage payment, and that equals your cash flow. So again, you want to evaluate it while you're living in it, and then after you move out. There's a little bit more leniency in how much profit you make while you're living in it, because obviously you're consuming part of the building, and you don't necessarily have to do a home run where your tenant is totally paying your mortgage, because you have to look at your opportunity cost of living somewhere else. Then what's really more important is the potential cash flow after you move out. Will this be a long-term good investment? So just taking some simple math as you're running your numbers, evaluating the deal. Let's say your expenses are $2,000. And then you calculate once you move out, you would be able to confidently collect $3,000 a month. Then that means you have $1,000 a month profit. That's a good investment. But now if that $3,000 was really $2,000, then you're just breaking even on the investment on your best case. And so what if something goes wrong? So that's probably a riskier property to live in one unit and rent out the other. So there's a lot of assumptions that go in the cash flow. I do have some other videos where I go really deep into how to calculate and manage cash flow. But I'll just throw out two things. One is you have to really look at your rental assumptions. And so obviously you're saying that it's a neighborhood you feel comfortable in living in, but you can't use rental assumptions beyond what the neighborhood bears out for the neighborhood. So no amount of amenities that you can add to really jump over what the median rental rate is for the area. Now it's possible you can be that outlier that gets a premium rent, but as far as on the front end and making your investment decision, that's risky. The second thing you should consider as you're evaluating your potential cash flow is how much of the operating expenses you can shift to the tenant in terms of separate utilities. Very important. So those are things, and then the amount of yard area, since that generally would probably be more in the landlord responsibility. And then, are you able to bake that into the rent effectively? So again, kind of looking at how you can shift the operating expenses is important, and also your assumption about the rent that you can make is very important. The third question is, does the property have a functional layout? So does each unit, do they have flaws that would be expensive to cure, that would make the unit more attractive or more designed optimally for a family or a tenant? So some of these flaws could be things like the only way to get to the one bathroom in the apartment is inside the bedroom, or maybe the kitchen kitchen is on the second floor versus the first floor or the main floor of the apartment. So these type of things kind of limit the attractiveness to tenants, as well as could damage the value. So when the appraiser is looking at the property, when they're kind of comparing like 2-bedroom units, and you're your property has some flaws, they're always going to kind of ding you in terms of valuation. So a lot of times these come up with properties that were originally single family and that just maybe the previous owners took shortcuts into converting it into doing the value added renovations to add a unit. So they're definitely not all perfect. Now there are some properties that were built originally as multifamilies, and those typically have the best layouts. But these are just things that you should watch out for if you see a property where it kind of has a non-optimal layout. Then that hurts you down the line in your cash flow assumptions at the end of the day. The first question to ask is, how long will it take to find a tenant in this area? So a lot of times people fixate on the median rent without kind of understanding how long it took to get that rent. So when I'm looking at, rents within an area, I'm also want to look at how long it took to get that rent, because sometimes maybe if the landlord dropped the rent sooner, they could make that up in year 2 by having a longer tenancy of a tenant, as opposed to holding out for 4 months for a certain rate. But anyway, the bottom line is, you want to understand, are you investing in an area that will generally be a lot easier to find tenants and that you can count on doing a turn within 30 days? Or are you investing in an area that may take you, 30, 60 days to find a decent tenant? Again, that should kind of weigh in your assumptions about cash flow. May not necessarily totally rule out an area, but it's important to kind of understand the dynamic of what it would take when the day comes when you have to even replace yourself as the occupant and find a new tenant for your place. You'll want to understand how long that's going to take. The fifth question you should ask is, what are the leases like? The leases that give you the most flexibility are month-to-month leases. Now, having a long-term lease where the lease is not going to expire for a tenant so long after you would buy the property is not inherently a bad investment. You just may not be able to do the house hack that way. The other thing that you want to find out about the lease beyond the term is, what are the requirements to give notification for ending the lease? A lot of times the default language in PA a lot of times is 30 days, but a lot of landlords may have negotiated or put in 60 days to give them more flexibility to plan as they're, going along with the lease. So it's important to know that up front, because that probably will weigh in a negotiation, as well as kind of dictate how quickly you will be able to close or how quickly you will be able to move into the property. Now, before I wrap up, I do want to mention a few points about the occupancy requirement. So part of the whole advantage to living in one unit and renting out the others is that you get favorable financing as an owner occupant for your primary residence. But the bank does, or the lender does, have some requirements as far as how you're actually living in the property. The number one requirement is that you generally have to move within 60 days of closing. So that's why if there's a unit that has a long-term lease that doesn't expire to 6 months after you would buy the property, you're not going to be able to use this strategy because you wouldn't be able to meet the 60-day clause. Second thing, you have to live in the property. So I said that right off the top. So you have to live in the property for 1 year. So if you don't have the flexibility to move to live in the property for at least 1 year, it's not going to work. I'm definitely not a proponent of committing any type of fraud of saying, kind of saying that you're going to live there for a year and not actually doing so. You actually do sign documents at the closing that say that you're going to live in the property, so you don't want to commit fraud. So I gave my disclaimers. So I'm definitely, support of people doing this strategy above board. And lastly, in terms of the occupancy from the tenants, it's actually a good thing that the property is not fully vacant when you move in, because those real rent dollars collected will help in the loan process, because they're going to have real rents to count as opposed to kind of theoretical rents as they're evaluating how much that you can borrow. Now, if you want more information about the loan process when you're buying a multifamily and living in the property, you'll want to watch the video that's appearing on the screen now. As always, thanks for watching and happy investing.